Hello again, and welcome to this lesson on tables questions for task 1 of the academic module of the IELTS test. So tables questions are one of the types of graphs that you could get in task 1 for writing. And, like pie charts, you may be required to discuss changes at points in time or just make comparisons between categories, and doing that successfully is really essential in how you present your data accurately and clearly in a way that's easy to understand. So if you haven't seen lesson 4 on line graphs and lesson 5 on pie charts, I recommend that you watch those first, because all of the essential differences between these types of data that I mentioned are discussed in those two lessons. Now, this particular lesson is just going to be talking about the context of these types of data in tables, but the task of identifying whether you're talking about changes in time or differences between categories, that's gone over in great detail in the previous two lessons that I mentioned. So what we're going to do is essentially look at a couple of tables questions and talk about what kind of information we would look for. Remember, the three parts of the report are introducing what the graph is showing, giving an overview, talking about the main features generally, and then going into specific detail. So talking about how we would do that for those questions. And then finally, we're going to look at a specific response to a specific tables question. So if we look at our first tables question, let's see. So it says the table below gives information about the underground railway system in 6 cities. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So comparisons where relevant, that's always important. We don't always need to make comparisons for every type of data we report, but there are some questions where we do. Now, if you think that the first thing that I mentioned about the difference between time, changes in time, and differences between categories, if you look at this, it's a little bit deceptive because you see these dates. But these are actually not about changes in time or data for particular categories seen at 2 different points in time. This is just another piece of data, information about the specific category, that is when the underground railway system was opened. So we can kind of not think about that as time and just kind of a fact about the railway system of the particular city. So the categories where the comparisons are more relevant would be kilometers of route, so how much track is there, and passengers per year in millions. And if we look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 4, we've got 6 categories with 18 pieces of information, 3 pieces for each one. So like in the pie charts lesson I mentioned, if you get a table like this with 10, 12 pieces of information, most likely it's going to be easy to describe each one, to talk about each one, mention each one specifically. If you've got this many, you definitely don't have time to do that. But you have to realize that if it's a real IELTS question, then it's been put together in such a way that it's possible to combine certain categories in certain ways to reduce the amount of information you need to write about. So like I said, when I see something like this, I immediately start looking for similarities. So the cities: London, Paris, Tokyo, Washington, Kyoto, Los Angeles. So they're all over the place. So I would discount that immediately because I don't really see a pattern. And again, like the patterns I'm talking about, you should be able to see pretty quickly. So it's not that there's a hidden pattern in the geography of these places. It's that probably there's no pattern there. So nothing there. Let's call those our 6 categories. And okay, kilometers of route. So we have 2 with very low numbers and 4 with higher numbers. So there's a big range between Washington, D.C. at 126 and London at 394, but those are all significantly higher than Kyoto and Los Angeles, which have 11 and 28 kilometers of track, respectively. So there's one difference. Let's look at passengers per million. Okay, so hundreds and thousands versus double digits. So again, 144 is, for Washington, D.C., is, it's closer to Kyoto and Los Angeles than the other 3, so we could sort of divide that in half, where London, Paris, and Tokyo each have, significantly more passengers per year than Washington, Kyoto, and Los Angeles. Okay, so there's some division there. So if I look at this, I can also notice that the times are earlier and later. So 1863, 1900, 1927, those tend to have more kilometers of route or more kilometers of track and higher numbers of passengers in the millions. Whereas Washington, Kyoto, and Los Angeles, built much later, 1976, 1981, 2001, tend to have smaller numbers of passengers per year in millions and fewer kilometers of route. So again, there are a few places where it doesn't fit exactly. Like I said, Washington D.C. 126, Tokyo 155. That's not a huge difference. But as a way of organizing the data, that's a good way to think about it. So let's think about older underground railway systems in London, Paris, and Tokyo and what they have in common. So more kilometers of route and higher numbers of passengers per year, and newer underground railway systems in Washington, D.C., Kyoto, and Los Angeles, which have in common that they've got fewer kilometers of route and lower numbers of passengers per year in millions. So that's just one way to look at the numbers. 45 and 50 for number of passengers per year in million in Kyoto and Los Angeles, 11 and 28 for kilometers of route. Those are similar, and you can discuss those perhaps in the same sentence in the way that I did in the pie charts lesson with similar categories. So in terms of how would we divide our paragraph, our details paragraph, that would be a good way to do it. Older systems, older railway systems, and newer railway systems. And what is our overview? That's essentially helped us find our overview. So overall, older underground railway systems tend to have higher numbers of passengers per year in millions and longer routes in the number of kilometers, while these numbers are lower for newer underground railway systems. You could include a little bit of extra data, like let's say London had the longest route and Tokyo had the highest number of millions of passengers per year, something like that. So you give us a little bit more information about that. London had the oldest system while Los Angeles has the newest system. Again, that's not quite as important as the other categories which are related. So again, the first one I mentioned about London and the kilometers of route, and Tokyo and the number of passengers, that would be a bit better. But essentially what you're talking about is the main difference I mentioned. Overall, the older underground railway systems tend to be longer and have more passengers per year than newer systems. Now, in our details paragraph, again, we're going to go into specific details about London, Paris, and Tokyo in one, and Washington, D.C., Kyoto, and Los Angeles in another. So that's how we would deal with a question like this, which doesn't deal at all with differences in time. Here's a second question where if you look at it, immediately you will see two dates, 1985 and 2000 at the top of the two categories. Again, I haven't even looked at the topic, but what I'm looking at is, okay, it's about differences in time, increases and decreases, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different categories. So I'm going to mention all of those in some way, and 2 different years for each. So again, I've got 18 pieces of data, and I'm probably not going to mention every single number. So the table below gives information about changes in modes of travel in England between 1985 and 2000. So how were people traveling in England in 1985, and how were they traveling in 2000? So both dates are in the past, so we'll be talking about this in the past tense, average distance in miles traveled per person per year by mode of travel, so number of miles. So when I look at something like this, again, I immediately start looking for connections, numbers that are similar. So okay, we've got all modes, 4740, 6475, car, 3199, 4806. So those are big numbers. Then I've got small numbers. Which ones are increasing and which ones are decreasing? So decrease, walking decreased between 1985 and 2000. Bicycling decreased. Cars went up. Local bus went down. Long distance bus went up. Train went up. Taxi went up. Other went up. And all modes went up. So, okay, people are traveling more now than they were in the past, and there have been decreases in walking, travel by bicycle, and local bus. So that's essentially, there's our overview, finding these similarities. So overall, people are traveling more in the year 2000 than they were in 1985, and the distances traveled increased in all modes of travel, mentioned, with the exceptions of walking, bicycle, and local bus, all of which decreased during the time period. There you go. There's your overview. So often looking at the data and sort of dividing it up and thinking of ways to talk about it will help you not only come up with your overview, also think about what are similarities, where can you combine information, how can you organize your body paragraphs. So let's think about that. So are there any similarities? So walking, bicycle, car, local bus, long distance bus, train, taxi, other. So, you know, they're all modes of transport. There's no real logical way to put them one in the other. I mean, you could have motorized versus non-motorized. That's kind of random. So let's choose increases and decreases. So let's have, in one paragraph, we're going to talk about walking, bicycling, and local bus. So those are decreases. And in the other paragraph, we're going to be talking about cars, trains, taxis, other. And those are increases. And if you look at the one number, which is much larger, so all modes down here is just all these numbers added up, I'm going to assume. And then the one number is much larger, cars, that would be worth mentioning, right? So that could even be included in our overview. So cars were the most. So if you think about the overview again with that information, is it too much? So all modes of travel increased from 1985 to 2000, with cars being the largest, the most frequent mode of travel in both years. There were increases in all modes of travel with the exception of walking, bicycles, and local bus. That's fine. That's a really good, complete, clear overview that explains a lot. Walking, bicycling, and local bus all decreased from 255 to 237 for walking, 429 to 274 for local bus, and 51 to 41 for bicycle. So that's enough. I've given all the data points. In a way to think about how we can combine this data to talk about it more concisely, let's think about big changes and small changes. So cars travel went up a lot. Long distance bus went up a lot. Train went up, but not as much. Taxi went up a lot, and other went up not as much. So we could say something like the most significant increases in travel were for car from 31.99 to 48.06, long distance bus from 54 to 124, and taxi from 13 to 42. Smaller increases were seen in the categories train and other. And make sure to put other in quotation marks. So you might give those details, you might give the numbers, you might not. But essentially, we've given a lot of data and we've divided everything up clearly, logically, so it's very clear. Some of these register a decrease, some register a large increase, and some register a smaller increase. And we've mentioned all the categories, which we need to do, and we've mentioned a number of data points, specific numbers, which we also need to do. And we've, by doing it, writing those sentences the way that I just mentioned them, you're going to get several data points per sentence. So even though you've mentioned most of the data points, you don't have to have a sentence for each one. That would be very long. So this is a way of combining data and kind of reporting it in a way that meets the requirements of talking about all the categories and also reporting specific data accurately in figures also. Okay, so here is our question underneath the lesson notes. We're going to look at the sample answer that I wrote. And so this is a tables question. And Ireland, Italy, Spain, Sweden, Turkey. 5 countries, 3 categories. So I've got 15 pieces of data. It's kind of a lot. But if we look at, so we're going to assume that we can probably combine some of these. The table below gives information on consumer spending on different items in 5 different countries in 2002. Okay, so let's have a look. Ireland, Italy, Spain, Sweden, Turkey. So they're mostly European countries. One country that is part in Europe and part in Asia, so no grouping there really. But we can see in all the countries the most money was spent on food, drinks, and tobacco. The second highest amounts were spent on clothing and footwear, and finally in leisure and education. And within those groups, we can also combine. So if we look at food, drinks, and tobacco, we can see Turkey 32.14%, Ireland 28.9%. Those are quite similar, and they're significantly higher than the other three, which are in the teens, 15, 18, 16. So that's possibly an area we can group together. Clothing and footwear, 6.4, 9, 6.5, 5.4, 6.6. So they're all around 6%, with the exception of Italy, which is 9%, and leisure and education, which is the lowest number for all of them, 2, 3, 4%. So those numbers are all quite similar. Okay, so if we have a look at the specific example, how I did that. So the table shows expenditures by consumers in 2002 for 3 categories in Ireland, Italy, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey. So again, the easiest thing to do is really just to paraphrase this information here, try to use it, change the order, change the word form, use synonyms where you can, repeat words where you can't. Again, you're not getting huge points for your first sentence. What your score is dependent on is what you do in the overview and the details paragraph. So in terms of overview, let's see if the way I kind of group that together, does that come out in my overview? So in summary, the highest spending in all countries was on food, drinks, and tobacco. So that was the first thing I noticed, with the lowest spending consistently on leisure and education for each country. So what I've said is food, drinks, and tobacco, those are the highest. Leisure and education is consistently low here. So this is a good example of a type of question where, you talk about the highs and the lows, and it's not that you don't mention clothing and footwear. Later you get into more detail about it. You could also add that detail here. I don't think it's necessary. So you could say, in summary, the highest spending in all countries is on food, drinks, and tobacco, with the lowest spending consistently on leisure and education for each country. Spending on clothing and footwear was in the middle position throughout, something like that. But basically, you want a balance of important details or important summary of important trends without going into too much detail to give yourself something to write more specifically about later. So the way I divided it also is similar. So Turkey and Ireland spent the most on food, drinks, and tobacco, with around 32 and 29% respectively. Following were Sweden, Spain, and Italy, which showed expenditures on these items from approximately 16 to 19%. So those last 3 countries I've just put in a range and described that. So very concisely, I've talked about spending in that category, mentioned all 5 categories, and gave specific data also. The second highest category for consumer spending was clothing and footwear, with Italy recording the highest figure at 9%. So now I'm talking about this aspect, which I haven't mentioned until now. The 4 remaining countries each accounted for approximately 6% of their consumer expenditures in this category. So again, those 4 numbers, 6.4, 6.5, 5.4, 6.6. Italy's really the only one that's significantly different, so that's what I mentioned. Finally, the lowest amount of expenditure was seen in the category of leisure and education, with the average being about 3%. Figures for spending on leisure and education ranged from a low of 1.98% in Spain to a high of 4.35% in Turkey. So again, I've combined this information to say, on average, countries are spending around 3%, and the range is the low of 1.98% in Spain and the high of 4.35% in Turkey. So I haven't given every single data point for this one. I didn't give every single data point for clothing and footwear or for food, drinks, and tobacco, but I combined the data where it was possible to do that, and that allows me to write a much more concise report that still gets in all of the important information. And again, like highest, lowest is generally a good strategy to deal with an overview if you're not sure how to. If you tend to write overviews that have like too much detail or give too much information, this kind of highest lowest strategy is often useful in terms of making sure that you give the big picture without going into too much detail or talking about too many of the trends. Okay, so if you look below this, you will see cohesive devices, referencing devices, and less common or useful vocabulary highlighted in the same essay. So this is good to go over. I have a look just to see how things are used. In summary, respectively, finally, 3. So one thing I mentioned in previous lessons is in task 1, you're not using a lot, just to make things clear. So in summary, overall, here's my overview. Respectively, that's a way of reporting data where you give, the names of the two categories and then the two figures in the same order. So first country, second country, number for the first country, number for the second country, respectively, means that's the convention that you're following. You know, approximations are important. So approximately 16 to 19%. That allows me to combine data. So again, there's quite a lot of good vocabulary in here for reporting data, combining data, thinking about that. The other thing that most people don't think about, referencing devices. So that's a way of referring to something that you've already mentioned. So if we look in the third paragraph, following were Sweden, Spain, and Italy, which each showed expenditures on these items. Which items? Food, drinks, and tobacco from the first sentence. Okay. In the last paragraph, the second highest category for consumer spending was clothing and footwear, with Italy recording the highest figure at 9%. The remaining countries each accounted for approximately 6% of their consumer expenditures. The consumer expenditures of those countries I just mentioned, the 4 remaining countries, in this category. Which category? Clothing and footwear. So most people use referencing devices without thinking about it, and as long as you have your writing checked and confirmed that that's okay, it's not necessary to think about much. If you do have an issue, you need to fix it because it is something that examiners are looking for specifically, and if you need Band 7 or higher, you have to be able to use referencing devices effectively. All right, so there you have the lesson on tables and the different types of data that can be presented to you for this type of question. So make sure you understand the distinction between changes in time and differences between categories and which one you have to do or whether you have to mention both. And get lots of practice for every type of Task 1 question to make sure that when you get to the exam, everything will go smoothly and you'll get the score that you need.